The following podcast contains mature language and spoilers. Listener discretion is advised. Anyone who listened to the Who's Who podcast is familiar with the bitch that there's too many new gods. And I wonder sometimes about that because you got the conspiracy theory that New Gods was a very popular book. There was an early victim of speculation that basically newsstand distributors were hoarding copies of the New Gods books and then giving it fraudulent reports to DC about the sales so they would make more money off of the books, potentially not even cover price, but actually inflated collector's market prices without DC actually getting the money, and thus sales were considered to be too poor to continue the line. I personally think that's a bunch of horse shit. That feels like a bunch of Trump is really the president kind of crap. I think fanboys loved things like the O'Neil Adams, Green Lantern, Green Arrow books, and Jack Kirby's New Gods, and I think the general public rejected it. And I think a good counter argument is Jim Starlin's work on Captain Marvel, Adam Warlock, Thanos. Jim Starlin's Captain Marvel run is what made his name. It's what made people start to know who Jim Starlin was and make him something of a fan favorite. But I don't think the sales were ever huge. Otherwise, Steve Englehart and Al Milgrom and Pat Broderick probably could have kept it going for longer after Jim Starlin left. When you've got a really popular book and the creator that helped make it popular leaves, there is attrition, of course. But fanboys are creatures of habit, and it takes them a while to completely shed a book that they had once loved. And Captain Marvel died off, about a year, 2 years at most after Jim Starlin left. So I think it did fairly well while he was on there, but I don't think it was ever gangbusters sales, right? And Starlin left, from what I understand, as he's wont to do because somebody pissed him off, and he ended up doing the Adam Warlock run. Started in Strange Tales, and then they revived the numbering of the old Warlock series from when Gil Kane and Roy Thomas were doing it. And the fact is, Starlin couldn't make Adam Warlock blow up the way that he had Captain Marvel, and I'm not sure how big Captain Marvel was anyway. I don't remember if it was Captain Marvel or Warlock where it was Starlin getting ticked that he didn't get the inker he wanted, but I want to say that it was something like that that caused him to drop Warlock. And the simple fact was they didn't have anybody take over Warlock after he left. They just canceled the book. And again, if Starlin were doing huge numbers, he probably wouldn't have left the book in the first place, or when he left the book, he would have gone directly to something that was high profile. But my recollection is after Warlock, he had sort of a cooling period. Bounced around, did this and that, but kind of took a hit to his visibility. But the thing is, Warlock had a cult following, Captain Marvel had a more sizable following, and so there was a build throughout the 80s to bring these properties back, and they were also reprinted a number of times. The Warlock run was reprinted in Fantasy Masterpieces back in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. It got the Baxter format miniseries in the mid 80s, and by the early 90s, Marvel had pretty much decided that they were going to bring back Adam Warlock specifically, and I think that Starlin was working on Silver Surfer at the time and basically said, okay, if you guys are going to bring back this character that I don't want you to bring back, I'm going to be the one who brings it back. That led into Infinity Gauntlet, which was a huge success, got adapted into a multi-billion-dollar movie. And so clearly, regardless of whether or not Warlock sold great when it was coming out, there was an audience waiting for them to bring those characters back. That audience apparently apostolicized for the book, and so you had a larger audience for a revival than you probably had during the original run. The problem I have with the theory of New Gods ever having been a really successful book is that that audience has never really been built, and there's been a lot of opportunities to build that audience. As with Starlin's Warlock run, New Gods got reprinted in the mid-80s in Baxter format. You had the New Gods featured prominently in the Superpowers toy line and the related Super Friends television shows. They did a Superpowers one, they did Galactic Guardians one, both of them had Darkseid in it, as well as Calabac, Desaad, Parademons, yada yada. There have been revivals at least once per decade for most of the key books in the Fourth Ward saga. To my recollection, the only one that was remotely successful was Walt Simonson's Orion run in the late 90s. That at least got, a year and a half, 2 years in, and was well regarded, has been collected in the meantime. But virtually everything else that was done, Cosmic Odyssey being an exception, most stuff done with New Gods, about the New Gods, just falls flat, and the audience never seems to build. The majority of people, in my experience, that have an interest in Darkseid specifically, enjoy him within the context of the DC Universe, and most specifically Superman. There's a lot of people that were were made fans of Darkseid by things like the Superman animated series. Darkseid seems to be this universal villain that people are drawn to, and people tolerate the broader New Genesis Apocalypse stuff, but it's still very niche, and I just don't think the mainstream has ever embraced this material. It's been pointed out that perhaps was one of the problems with the Zack Snyder movies, was that they were built around Apocalypse and Darkseid, and it's a property and a concept that still hasn't been embraced by the broader public. And the more you try to get into the lore of the New Gods, the harder it is to build an audience, because it's never really had an audience. I was introduced to the original Batgirl, Barbara Gordon, probably through the 1960s TV show. Thought she was cool, thought she was cute. I saw her in the comic books as well. She did not have a very strong presence in comic books when I was a kid, so I didn't gravitate toward her as much in fourth color as I did on live action and the cartoons. I was reintroduced to her as Oracle, where she had a much more pronounced role in the DC universe than she had as Batgirl. She just made sense within that universe and could contribute more in the role of a super intelligent information aggregator and a coordinator for the various heroic operations in the DC universe. But Batgirl is a name as valuable IP. DC made numerous efforts to exploit that IP with other characters, legacy characters. For my money, the most interesting was Cassandra Cain, who is this super martial artist, one of the greatest in the DC universe, eventually revealed to be the daughter of Lady Shiva, one of these characters who has become a benchmark for other martial artists within that universe. How good are you? I think that they've been inconsistent in expressing how good of a martial artist Lady Shiva is versus, say, Batman. But there's a perception that she is stronger, that in an actual fight she could take the Batman, and that arguably her daughter was even better than she was, or at least comparable enough to where Batman wouldn't want to tangle with her. And she had a costume that was partially modeled off of Michelle Pfeiffer's suit from Batman Returns, which has never really been exploited within the comic books. So it's a good way of keeping it in the family and taking advantage of an iconic look. So that's my personal favorite. There's a lot of people who like Stephanie Brown as well in that role. I felt like there was more of a reach. She'd already had an established identity as Spoiler, and she was in a bunch of Robin comic books that I didn't read and don't care about and never will read. Not as meaningful to me, but she's got her fans. And of course, you've also got Bette Kane, who was the original Batgirl from the 1950s. People are aware that the Batgirl from the live action TV show is essentially created for that show, and that they introduced the comic book character as a sort of a setup. I don't remember which one came first, but she existed specifically to reflect what they were going to do on the TV show in a costume that was closer to Batman's, where in the 1950s, again, referencing the Jack Schiff period, Batman was way too colorful, had some very gaudy characters within his orbit. The Batgirl character from that time period, who had a hyphen, if I recall correctly, was modeled more after Robin with the reds and the greens, which is to say she had a hideous outfit. And because she was part of a period in Batman's history that is not well regarded, and she was usurped by Barbara Gordon, the Bette Kane incarnation has always been sort of an afterthought, a footnote, because they decided to borrow from Superman in the naming of Robin's second identity of Nightwing. At times, they've tried to assign the old Batgirl the name Flamebird to reflect the dynamic from the heroes from Kandor and the assumed identities of Superman and Jimmy Olsen in old 50s stories. Never made a ton of sense, because you hear Flamebird, you're reading comic books, you're thinking that this character is going to have some sort of fire powers, where she's basically just cut-rate Batgirl. Prototype, not the finished model, that sort of thing. I think most recently they were calling her Hawkfire in that Batwoman series that J.H. Williams and Greg Rucka did. I see value in her as a character with a history within the DC universe, with a role to play within the Batman family, yada yada. Not really a compelling character outside of that legacy, though. And so the idea was just lump them all together into a team book, call them Batgirls, and be done with it, which is funny because I think DC's actually done that since then. I didn't have any real game plan for that. I almost immediately started tearing it apart, because it occurred to me essentially that I was much more interested in the Birds of Prey than I was in a bunch of Batgirls getting thrown together, even with Huntress being in the mix. I mean, but the simple fact is I love Huntress as a solo character. I don't really care as much about her in a team format, although I did like her in Birds of Prey. And so having her hang out with a bunch of other Batgirls didn't really interest me, so I eventually spun her off into her own book, and the Batgirls property fell apart almost immediately. Oh, goody, this will be fun. Let's talk about the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor. I did not read a ton of DC comics in the pre-crisis period. A lot of what I did read did not turn me on. The art wasn't as good as Marvel. They didn't make as much sense as Marvel. They weren't as cool as Marvel. The characters weren't as well written as Marvel. So I gravitated toward the good Marvel books and mostly stuck with Titans and Brave and the Bold and some of the other team books because they were the most Marvel-like books that DC was putting out. I had a vague awareness of the multiverse at DC Comics, and I've often advocated for that. I've talked a lot about that in recent years, and it's very much a revisionist history on my part, in my personal history, I should say, because I was all in for the post-crisis streamlined DC universe. To a large degree, my strongest exposure to the multiverse was the one issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths that I got while it was actively being produced, and it introduced me to the cosmology of the DC universe. DC, for most of its existence, has not really been the most cosmic of universes. Marvel had Kirby, Marvel had Starlin, Marvel understood how to do cosmic. They did it very well. It worked perfectly within that pseudo-scientific universe that is at the heart of what Marvel is. DC is not that. DC is a magical fairy tale place. DC does not work necessarily very well with pseudoscience. They work much better with theology, with mythology, but they do have some strong sci-fi concepts, and those have been built up quite a bit in recent years. One of the best, of course, is the Green Lantern Corps and the associated lore that goes with that. If you follow Green Lantern, then you know that you had a most evolved race of all the races, all the species, however you want to put it, within the ancient DC universe, the Malthusians. One of the Malthusians, Krona, decided that he needed to know about the creation of the universe, the Big Bang. If God was involved in the creation of the universe, he wanted to see God's hand at work. And despite a lot of warnings from his fellow Malthusians, that was forbidden and that will do great harm when you do that, Kronos continued. He literally saw what appeared to be God's hand forming the universe. It created an explosion of antimatter energy, and this is what the Malthusians saw as being the unleashing of evil into the universe, but more commonly is recognized as the birth of the multiverse, where you had originally had a single universe. Krona's unleashing of these primal energies, these seminal energies, replicated that universe an infinite number of times with infinite variations, and therefore you had the infinite Earths. And so you had the Golden Age heroes that were published back in the 1940s, mostly on a place called Earth 2. You had the Fawcett characters like Captain Marvel, who had been published by an entirely different publisher and had a flavor that was very different from anything that DC had. They ended up on a place called Earth S. You had the Quality Heroes, which was another group of characters that were active during World War II. Most of them were co-created by Will Eisner. When DC acquired those characters from Quality once it went defunct, they went to a place called Earth X. It was called Earth X because they couldn't get away with calling it Earth Swastika, because one of the premises of that story arc involving the characters that they eventually dubbed the Freedom Fighters was that you had an Earth where the Nazis won World War II, and these were the heroes that were continuing to fight the good fight in the wake of this Nazi superiority. When I speak in favor of a DC multiverse, it's usually based on that being a thing that works for DC characters that does not work for Marvel characters. I want everything to connect in the Marvel Universe. I want them to have one continuity and have as few deviations from that continuity as possible. It's such a well-realized universe, and again, because it's a pseudoscientific universe, it's important to maintain the suspension of disbelief in that universe, whereas disbelief is a starting point when it comes to DC Comics. Also, the simple fact is that so many properties within DC comic books and so many of the flavors of those individual companies that were acquired by DC just don't gel as a single universe. So to my mind, you're never going to have the best quality Captain Marvel stories without being on a Captain Marvel Earth that supports the type of stories that character works best on. The Freedom Fighters are most interesting when they're on an Earth that was conquered by the Nazis and seeing how that plays out. It's not a world that makes sense for the regular DC universe, and it gives them a purpose. So long as the Freedom Fighters are on Nazi Earth fighting the Nazis, they have a reason for existing, where when you try to integrate them into a singular DC universe, they basically suck. They're just not good enough characters, strong enough characters, valuable enough, contributing enough to the universe. Very anachronistic. They're so grounded in that World War II mentality that they don't translate very well into anything resembling a modern sphere. So when I advocate for a DC multiverse, that's what I'm advocating for, is finding a place where you can have an isolated continuity that works best for these characters that don't really fit within the core DC universe. And it's also fun because the DC universe allows for a bunch of crossing over between universes universes without it necessarily breaking the concept, since really most of the DC characters work best within their individual spheres rather than as a collective anyway. That's why you have something like a Justice League where you have a space where these characters can go off and do stuff together, but in their individual stories, they usually work better playing by their own rules. Just like the Batman, the whole concept of the Batman falls apart if you think too hard about the fact that this guy has close ties to the Justice League, and there's no reason why these guys couldn't just come in and clean up Gotham. Superman alone should be able to do that, much less the entire Justice League. So it's basically a crime against humanity if Batman says, no, you can't go to Gotham. And in fact, that assault on the suspension of disbelief and that assault on the logic of Batman stories by his association with the Justice League is one of the reasons why I dislike the character of Batman these days, because within a shared universe, he just doesn't make sense and he's a prick. Another one I stumbled upon and wanted to play with was The Rebellion, a 2002 series that ended up running for 8 issues by Jimmy Palmiotti, Justin Gray, and Juan Santa Cruz. This was set in the year, I think, 2180 or thereabouts, and it's basically your typical oppressive government that's outlawed religion. It has strict controls over population, and then you have this group called the Strays, who are rebels, many of whom were born outside of the accept parameters of this oppressive government, and so they're fighting for their very existence, and in some cases they're fighting for religious liberty as well, which probably played better in 2002 than it does these days, to be honest with you. At this point, I'm kind of pro-religious oppression. The Resistance had this interesting concept where there wasn't a single cover, and there wasn't variant covers. What they would do is they'd get a multiple artists. I think typically Bill Sienkiewicz was one of the mainstays, and then other ones as well, and they would actually draw a piece of the cover, and there would usually be between 2 and 4 different sections from these different artists showing this dark future setting. Pretty cool idea, actually. And I think they had some of them do interiors as well. And so I took a bunch of those concepts and dropped them into Crisis on Infinite Time and tried to include some stuff from the 23rd century of DC Comics. There was a strange adventure story about a guy who travels back through time and determines that the way in which Earth could be saved, or actually it was an alien planet that could be saved, was by having wristwatches, essentially like timepieces that used mechanisms, which means we'd be pretty well screwed these days since nobody uses a mechanical timepiece anymore. And I also brought in Gary Concord, the Ultraman, who ultimately goes to another century from that time period, but was at one point in that particular century. There was also one of the Flash incarnations was from that century. There was a Legends of the Dead Earth annual for Legionnaires in which Excess goes to 100th century and runs into Ultraman and some other heroes that were like one-offs. I figured I'd drag them into it as well. Another project that I would have assumed was creator-owned, but for some reason actually belongs to DC Comics, was a 2006 Wildstorm series called Skyrunner, Sky spelled with an E. This was by a guy I never heard of named Alan Warner and drawn by Ale Garza. And I think it's pretty clear that they were trying to do Battle Chasers 2.0. It's this high fantasy series where a girl's sister is decapitated and her niece and nephew, who are twins, are kidnapped by this bad guy. And so she somehow manages to kill a god and goes out to try to rescue the twins. But because of that ability to kill a god, she attracts a lot of attention. Specifically, there was an African sorcerer, being that I'm trying to tie this into DC Comics. If I'm thinking ancient African sorcerer, I'm thinking of Dr. Mist. So he became an identity of Dr. Mist. And then there was a version of the Green Knight that was also fixated on killing gods. And then there was like this assassin person. And so I'm like, well, you know what? If we're dealing with god killers, then that would probably make sense to play around with the Amazons and the little quasi-story arc I had in there called All God's Children. So they're going to go in there and try to kill some of those gods. That's a use for this concept. The storyline never got finished, by the way. They put together a team by the 6th issue that were called the Fates something or other. I don't remember anymore, which would have been a good idea to probably tie to Dr. Fate, but I ended up not doing that because I had other things going on with Dr. Fate. But they basically get to the team together and then they never actually get to do anything as a team because the series ends and there's a little to be continued with a question mark, and well, guess what? Was never continued. I'll also say that for me, Endgame was always going to be, or at least from like the late 90s, early 2000s on, for me, I always wanted to see Barbara Gordon and Dick Grayson get together and be a couple. Thought that was a good combination of skill sets. I think that Dick is a solid detective, but would more greatly benefit from the networking that Oracle can provide. I think in terms of chemistry, they work well together. I think definitely more so than Nightwing and Starfire. There's a period there where they were going to do a mini series where they were going to marry those two characters off, have them adventure together just never really fit for me. It always felt like the sort of thing that worked okay in the team setting with the new Teen Titans. But once you start trying to spotlight those characters in their own stories away from the team, so you're spanning too many genres. You're asking too much of the premise. Those two character types just don't work all that well together. And frankly, for me, you need to have Nightwing be the dominant character. This is the character who is one of the most famous comic book characters of all time, with a historic legacy going back to the very beginnings of comic books. And then you have an energy projector that got introduced in the early 80s. It's just can't give them an equal standing in the stories. And it's hard not to have the non-power detective get outshone by the person who flies around and comes from an alien world. There's just an essential incompatibility there in terms of storytelling. It's okay for a team book, just doesn't work if you're trying to do stories specifically about Nightwing. He's just going to be outshone in terms of manifestations of power. Get him with Barbara Gordon. There's a greater parity there because there are different skill sets, because they both had successful series that weren't necessarily reliant. They were peripheral to Batman, but their success was reliant upon their own contributions to the Batman family. They just have really good chemistry. I really like Barbara Gordon. I really like Dick Grayson, so I enjoy them, two of them together. I also like the idea of having a guy who is an aspirational figure, a hottie, as it were, devoting himself to a paraplegic woman. Why have Black Canary drafted into the Batman family and going off on missions for Batgirl when Nightwing's right there? And those two could be a romantic and professional pairing. So I like putting those two together. I ship it. And so speaking to that, me, myself, as a comic book fan of going on half a century, I've read a lot of damn comic books, and I've read plenty of comic books that have featured fourth world concepts in them. But the only time I actually committed to reading a chunk of the run by the original creator, Jack Kirby, was the Jack Kirby's New Gods collection that was put out in 1998. It was a black and white edition. It was basically either a ripoff of or a antecedent of the Marvel Essential editions, and then DC, of course, did their Showcase Presents editions. Cheap, super low quality, black and white bulk reprints of material that they didn't have to pay heavy royalties on. And so this collection only reprinted the New Gods book, the core book, the 11 issues that were produced by Jack Kirby before he left DC, or I think that the book was canceled before he left DC, which is another problem with the theory that they were ever popular New Gods. And I read that within a couple of years of it coming out, so you're talking about 20 plus years since I've read it. I've yet to ever reread it. I remember a few key stories, one in particular that really gave me a sense of how Orion could be an interesting character and what sets him apart from other DC characters, other New Gods characters. Of all the New Gods, I'd say Orion is probably the one that I have the most interest in. That's probably why I bought the 2-pack action figures with Orion and Darkseid sculpted to resemble Jack Kirby's artwork. I waited 15 plus years after they came out to buy them. I was actually, that was one of the times when Shag came to Houston and we hit some of the local comic shops, and I went ahead and bought the 2-pack while I was with him, I think from Nan's Comics and Games. Tangent. Point is, even me as a pretty hardcore comics guy, I've only had limited exposure to the New Gods. And as a typical fan, I've actively avoided reading anything involving the Forever People, who've had the fewest number of revivals, and even the one that most people think of, the late 80s one with Mark Evanier and Paris Cullens, I think most of us probably think of that as an ongoing series. It was actually a mini-series. I've read the first issue a couple of times at this point because I got it as a floppy and I reread it for Siskoid's project. And the thing is, Siskoid keeps insisting in comments related to who's editing that he is a fan of the Forever People and he enjoys those characters and likes seeing developments with those characters. And I have trust in Siskoid's judgment, but at the same time, I'm a person who's kind of known for not liking things. So there's very good odds that regardless of how much affection and potential seen in the property that Siskoid has, I'm not necessarily going to share that. But I've tried to do my research in order to do a decent job with this, and the New Gods Fourth World stuff is something that I'm doing a lot with as a sort of subline within the project. And I'm trying to inform myself as much as possible. The problem is there's a lot of material spanning a lot of decades, and the majority of that material, the core of that material, was written by Jack Kirby, who not the best scripter in the world. So anyhow, getting back to the multiverse though, Krona creates the multiverse, and in doing so, he also creates two distinct beings, the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor. And essentially, the Monitor is a being of enormous power that exists in the positive matter universe, which is where most of the DC characters exist in, whereas the Antimatter Monitor, the Anti-Monitor, his dark twin, exists within the Antimatter universe, which I don't remember if the universe or the world is called Quard, but I think he's born on Quard. And so that's obviously a universe that is anathema to the positive matter universe. When these things interact with each other, they by necessity are going to explode because they are incompatible energy types, incompatible universes. And the whole premise of Crisis on Infinite Earth is you have this Anti-Monitor being who is power mad and is using antimatter to absorb worlds, these infinite multiversal Earths, to increase his own power. It basically absorbs them and it takes in their energy for himself and becomes more and more powerful. And because of this being's willingness to destroy whole worlds and whole universes, the Anti-Monitor is becoming more and more powerful. And by contrast, the more moral, empathetic Monitor is becoming less and less powerful and has less and less ability to confront his evil twin. Now, the Monitor was introduced in DC comic books a year or more before Crisis on Infinite Earth, and they didn't quite know what they were doing with him, so he was actually a broker who was overseeing various mercenaries and assassins who would attack heroes and such. Eventually, they sort of explained that away as, I think, sort of a test, or it was a way for him to keep tabs with all the different metahumans that he was going to need to form an army to fight against the Anti-Monitor to prevent the Anti-Monitor from destroying and absorbing all the known universes. And so the Monitor, within the course of Crisis on Infinite Earth, dies fairly early on. I think in the third issue, he's betrayed by his acolyte, the Harbinger, who has been mentally possessed by the Anti-Monitor. And it's a way of, building up the tension. This is the guy who tells all the heroes in the positive matter multiverse what's going on and tries to rally them. And then this sort of leader figure ends up dying and they have to sort of figure things out for themselves. And again, it's another opportunity for the increasing power and increasing menace of the Anti-Monitor. By the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the heroes have managed to consolidate the remaining Earths into one universe that, everybody is supposed to be compatible with one another. Everybody's supposed to have a shared history that's been revised retroactively. And the Anti-Monitor is supposed to have been destroyed, but he still continues to exist. They have to fight him one more time. But after that, he is quote unquote dead, and he stays that way for decades. And it wasn't until Jeff Johns came around and started playing with the concept of the Anti-Monitor more and more, tying it into his Blackest Night story, where basically the Black Lantern cores rings, I believe, are formed out of the body or the armor of the deceased Anti-Monitor. Of course, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, nobody's supposed to remember that there was ever a crisis and that there ever was an Anti-Monitor. So there's a lot of hand-wavy explaining stuff, how they're able to access the Anti-Monitor, interact with his corpse, and build a core out of that. But if you haven't read Blackest Night, basically it's a core of zombies. It's all the people who died in the DC universe, who are of note, who are metahumans or were significant in the comic books. They've been dead, so these rings show up, land on their fingers, reanimate them, and then these are creatures that are difficult to kill, that are running around trying to inspire manifestations of strong emotions within the emotional spectrum so they can devour those strong emotions and then kill the host and then turn them into a Black Lantern so they are increasing their numbers. It's not a bad premise. If you've ever read Blackest Night, it's one of the best crossovers DC ever did, but also because of things like the Sinestro Corps War and Blackest Night, you are playing around with concepts that I think were probably better off left alone, like the Anti-Monitor. As the Anti-Monitor gets more and more developed and the cosmology of the DC universe starts to expand going into the 20-teens, it's revealed that the Anti-Monitor and the Monitor were not just two distinct beings created in two distinct universes, but they were actually both the children of a greater omniversal goddess called Petua. And there's a few other siblings besides that are involved with this stuff. And it leads into the whole dark multiverse thing, which explodes the concept of the multiverse.
You're such an inspiration for the ways that I will never, ever choose to be. Oh, so many ways for me to show you how your saviour has abandoned you. We think you're special. Dr. Ange, B. Asmarine, Bender 303, Bill at Spy Vinyl, Billy Hines, Brad Lonard, Captain Entropy, who added, "Og, I love that JLA Wildcats crossover. Looking forward to your coverage of yet another unexpected topic, Frank." Chris at Bat Books for Beginners, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, Dave's Comic Heroes blog, Dead End Kid, who added, I always forget about Maxima, and I cannot commit to a Doom Patrol show. I just can't make myself. Any more than I've read the Gerard Way DP, I just cannot handle how Doom Patrol gets fed through a wood chipper every 4 to 10 years. Cliff Steele is the most put-upon full-body amputee in the history of sci-fi cybernetics. Let the poor bastard retire. Regarding Shelved Wetworks podcast, maybe, just maybe, I'll have a complete run of all the singles by the time you decide to dust off the recordings. They're deeply dumb books, but damn if Wilts doesn't bring some action manga vibes to the whole vamps versus werewolves versus symbiotes thing. Del Dracula, Derek W.C. of History of Comics on Film, Dr. Pop Culture, Ed Moore, The Hammer Strikes, Random Geek, E-Stuff, Iowa's Joe was JMT Productions, Julia Rowell, Keith G. Baker, Lorenzo Sleestack, Miguel Quiroz. Men, My Comic Book Collection 70s to 90s, Richard Field, Roger Preby, Ronald Clark, Sam Lowe, Satin Tights, a Wonder Woman podcast, Scott X, Sean Phillips, Siskoid, Superbound, Thirsty's New and Used. Tim Price, the Podcrasher, who added, Same, JLA Wildcats was a blast, and Twins are rising.
The preceding program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials contained therein are believed borrowed under fair use with no copyright infringement intended. Please feel free to leave comments at Rolled Spine's Productions WordPress blog. You can also send us Twitter comments through the Rolled Spine Podcast Twitter. Thank you for listening.